Challenges to effective listening. In this video, we're going to be going over listening apprehension, listening styles, processing approach. We're going to do a quick exam prep and then a reflection question. Here's our first listening challenge, listening apprehension. So this is similar to, if you remember, communication apprehension, feeling anxious about communicating for some reason. Listening apprehension is the same, but for taking in information. So when I first heard this, I kind of was like, why would someone feel anxious about that? But when you really think about it, there's a lot of reasons why people have listening apprehension. So like I said, this is just the anxiety we feel about listening, and it may increase when we worry about misinterpreting a message or when we're concerned about how the message may affect us psychologically. It makes it just difficult for us to focus on a message. Those are kind of the main things that I wanted to pick out to talk about. Here's some causes. So absorbing important info, when you think about, like, say that you are job training and trying to take in all the information that you're supposed to do, you may feel anxious about what you're hearing and feeling like you're not going to get everything correctly, that you don't understand fully. And then content is confusing. So that's another cause. That might be like, say you're taking a difficult course this semester and it's hard for you to take in all the information. You don't know, for me, I got that a lot, like when I first started taking math courses. Luckily, I had a great math instructor that helped me through that anxiety, but I always felt a lot of anxiety going into a math class because I just felt like it was such difficult content and I felt like I just couldn't understand. And so it made it hard for me to want to listen. All right. So then another cause might be stressed about other things. I think this is a big thing for a lot of people. If we're sick or we're feeling overwhelmed, it's going to make it really hard for us to listen well. And so then, like say your friends wanted to talk to you about something and it may just be like, oh, I feel anxious about this interaction because I don't have a lot I can give right now because I'm feeling overwhelmed and, things like that. So then, not your first language. I think this is obviously a major one. I think about this a lot. If I lived in a place where the language wasn't my first language, I would probably struggle with this a lot. So things like traveling abroad, that can cause you to have listening apprehension. It can cause you to feel like, oh, I'm not going to understand this. And so we kind of try to like pull away. So these are all aspects of listening apprehension. We all get it from time to time for some reason. I think a lot about, like, if you have to have a hard conversation with someone, or if you've ever like gone into what is that called? Like a job review, like your boss reviewing you. You may feel really anxious about like, oh, I don't know if I want to hear everything that they have to say. So those might be moments when you're experiencing listening apprehension. Next, we have our second listening challenge, which is listening styles. So this is a big one. This is probably a bigger part of our chapter. But listening styles are our favored and usually unconscious approach to listening. This may change depending on the situation or goals for the interaction. So what this means is when I start describing one of these four listening styles, you may be like, okay, yeah, that's how I usually am. Doesn't mean that we're always that, but it's just our preferred style or what we tend to lean towards. And it may shift depending on the kind of situation we're in or what kind of goals are needing to be met. But for the most part, you kind of have one that you fall into more often. So the first thing that I also wanted to say is that each one of these has strengths to it and it also has weaknesses. So I don't want you to think that if you fall into one of these, you're like, well, I'm just a bad listener and all these things. There's a time and a place for all of them. And they all have their weaknesses as well. So let's start with the first one, which is content-oriented listeners. So content-oriented listeners focus on and evaluate the facts and evidence. This type of listener appreciates details and enjoys processing complex messages. They may ask questions to get even more information. This is what my husband is. He wants to know. He doesn't like when you just overshare or there's not a point to the information or a point to the details. But I find him often whenever you're talking to him or I'm talking to him going well, what about this or what about that? He just wants all these quick facts about surrounding the situation. So I would think he would be a content oriented. So the strength of a content-oriented listener is that they're good at understanding and remembering details, which is great. But one of the weaknesses is sometimes they miss the overall point. and or they're unaware of the speaker's feelings. I think sometimes my husband does that. Like he's kind of unaware of like the emotional part of it, or like the empathetic aspect. He's more just like, let's get the content and like you know what I mean. So yeah, so you can see both sides, how there's a strength to that and a weakness. All right, so people-oriented, and this is what I am. People-oriented listeners focus on the feelings of conversational partners. This type of listener tends to notice whether their partners are pleased or upset and will encourage them to continue speaking with nonverbal cues. So I do that a lot. I mean, if someone's talking to me, I'm often nodding and smiling at you and and doing those things, because I want you to know that I'm listening. I'm wanting you to know that I still hear, like I hear you, and I'm encouraging. I want you to keep talking. So the strength is that I often, I understand people's feelings, and I can very easily offer emotional support. And I can very easily match someone's emotions. But my weakness is sometimes I miss the important details or fail to evaluate the facts and evidence. Like maybe I'm just really focused on how you're feeling, but I'm really not fully listening to the content, or I'm not thinking about like, okay, let me analyze the facts here. And I would say sometimes that would be true for me. All right, then there's action-oriented. Action-oriented listeners focus on the ultimate point of the message. This type of listener tends to get frustrated with disorganized messages and rambling. They often anticipate what will be said and try to finish the speaker's sentences. Now that I'm saying this, sometimes I'm like, well, sometimes my husband's content, sometimes he's action. So I'm not really sure right now. But I would say one of my best friends, Simone, she is an action-oriented. I remember when we lived together in college, she always would say, Helen, point. Like she would, because I like to give all the details. I share all the details. I love hearing details. I would say that, if I had to mix two of these, I would be people and content. And I like details. But some people don't. They want you to get to their point. And otherwise, I feel like you're rambling. So I got really good at telling a story and then going, wait, bottom line. I would always go bottom line and tell her exactly what the point was. So, a strength for this is that people like this notice inconsistencies very well, and they can get things done quickly, which is great. But a weakness is they often struggle to hear people out and can miss important details. So like while Simone could get to the point quickly and could understand fast, like because she was such a quick thinker, sometimes she missed the emotional aspect of it. And sometimes she would respond in a way that I was like, that's not really how I was hoping she'd respond. And then I'd have to tell her how I was feeling. She was like, oh, okay, because she missed it. All right. So then there's time-oriented. And time-oriented listeners prefer brief conversations and use nonverbal cues to signal their annoyance. So this would be I love my father-in-law, but this would kind of be my father-in-law. He often is like, if he like feels like you're taking up a lot of time and he needs to get stuff done, he's often like, yes, like he'll do those things, like these nonverbal cues where you're like, okay, I need to speed up. This type of listener tends to tell people how much time they have and use nonverbals to rush the speaker. So I don't know if you've ever experienced people like that, or if you're that person, but often, like it might be something like, yes, okay, finish it. And they're like, not a lot, or do those things almost to make you like, I need to go. So, a strength is that these people who are conscious of, and respectful of people's time, they're also probably really highly effective in a workplace, getting things done. However, a major weakness of this is they obviously miss details because they're not really listening fully. But also, they can be insensitive to feelings. So we want to always make sure that we're paying attention to both aspects. And just because you fall into one of these categories, like I said, I kind of fall into a couple. It doesn't mean that you're always that. And it doesn't mean that you're unable to pay it. If you're a time-oriented, it doesn't mean that you can't pay attention to feelings. It's just that you need to be more aware of that. So our last listening challenge is processing approach. If you remember with the perception process, we had that dual processing, meaning you had the unconscious and the conscious processing. Unconscious had like the heuristics aspect to it. Well, we have kind of a similar thing here with listening. We have a passive processing approach, or we can have an active processing approach. And so passive means that like the habitual and unconscious process of receiving messages as if on autopilot. So have you ever been talking to somebody and you can tell they're just like nodding, and they're not really listening? My husband does this a lot. And I could be like, oh, so pigs were flying the other day. Sometimes I'll just throw in random comments to see if he's actually listening. He's like, oh, yeah. It is not at all. Right. So that would be a passive listening where you're kind of acting like you're listening, but you're not really taking it in. You might do this sometimes in class, not to call anybody out, but I know, like, even as a student myself back in the day, I would get really bored sometimes and zone out, and I would just sit there and nod at the teacher like I was really listening. You know, it happens. We may attend only to certain parts of a message and assume the rest. I think this also sometimes happens, especially like if we're in an argument or we're in conflict with somebody. Sometimes we only hear a little bit of their message and then we just like stop listening. And so we're not really kind of passively hearing everything else because we're just wanting to say what we think. And then we tend to do this when we are not really interested or when multitasking. Like with my husband, he normally doesn't just listen to me like that if he's sitting there looking at me. It's normally if he's looking at his phone or he's watching something on TV or things are going on around us. Like if we go out to eat and there's lots of stuff happening around us, that's when I've noticed he kind of goes into this like passive autopilot type listening. So on the contrary to that, though, we have active. Active listening is the deliberate and conscious process of attending to, understanding, remembering, evaluating, and responding to the messages we receive. So this is going to be like conscious processing because you have to think. Your brain attends, right, in the perception process. It attends to certain messages. Same thing with listening. Like you have to say, okay, I'm going to actively attend to your message, right, and block everything out. And that's a skill. It's something that we have to learn, but if we can learn it, it is a valuable part of our lives. I mean, for our interpersonal relationships, for our future career goals, for our current scholastic goals, right, our academic goals, those things, if you can be an active listener, are only going to thrive. Here's your first exam prep for Chapter 6. Pause the video and answer the questions, and when you're ready, you can press play. Please make sure to answer these, especially for any of our in-class discussions or online forums, because we'll want to be ready to talk about that when the time comes. I'll provide my answers once you submit your knowledge checks. Now take a minute to reflect. In what ways has your preferred listening style helped or hindered your interpersonal interactions? Again, make sure to write this down on your knowledge check so we can talk about this in class or on an online forum.